ice cold. I want to welcome all of you to the Rosenmeier Forum tonight to hear our distinguished speaker, Mr. Tom Hanson. The Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government honors the legacy of Gordon Rosenmeier, who represented Crow Wing and Morrison counties in the Minnesota State Senate for 30 years, from 1941 to 1971. During his legislative service, Rosenmeier achieved the reputation of being both a principled conservative and being the most powerful and influential legislator in all of Minnesota history. But what made Rosenmeier unique was the fact that he exercised his power with wisdom, with integrity, and great humility, qualities that are rare today in our world and even rarer in American politics. Former CLC President Sally Inney led the effort in 1988 and 1989 to create the Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government, which sponsors lecturers and distinguished officials speaking on the great issues of the day. Our speaker tonight, Mr. Tom Hanson, currently is the diplomat in residence at the University of Minnesota Duluth and has taught diplomacy at Carleton College in Northfield. He also chairs the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations. Mr. Hanson also brings great experience to his knowledge on foreign policy, on U.S. foreign policy, and also in international affairs. Mr. Hanson is a former officer of the U.S. State Department that included service in the embassies of East Germany, France, Norway, Russia, and the former Soviet Union. Mr. Hanson also has worked as a staff member to both the U.S. House and U.S. Senate Committees on Foreign Relations. It is my distinct honor to introduce to you tonight our distinguished speaker, the diplomat in residence at the University of Minnesota, Mr. Tom Hanson. Let's give him a big welcome. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks so much, Steve. Thank you very much, Steve, for that kind introduction. Nice to see everyone again. I love coming up here each year, being with the community up here and discussing these global issues together. And, you know, I'm going to give an update on a number of the pressing issues of the day, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza, of course, the tragic situation unfolding in Gaza, relations with China, et cetera. You know, all of these issues today are somehow interwoven. And if there's a common denominator to a lot of these issues and U.S. policy as it's developed in these issues, I think it's the U.S. competition with China. In Washington today, there's a bipartisan consensus that we face a major great power challenge from a rising China. And many other issues flow from this outlook in Washington. And China is a dimension of really all the issues we'll be talking about today, whether Ukraine, Gaza, or other areas, as I'll try to illustrate. You know, for the U.S., China is a threat, a challenger to what we call the rules-based order, which is sort of the mantra in Washington these days. For Joe Biden, the world of today is one of a contest between autocracy and democracy. He very much frames issues in that regard, and he has in mind China when he talks about autocracy, of course, Russia to some extent as well. So, but from China's point of view, they see the United States pursuing a policy of containment against them. As Xi Jinping said recently, really not too long before the summit that recently took place with Joe Biden, he said that the U.S. today is engaged in all-around containment, encirclement, and suppression of China, and that this is something that China has to resist, that the United States is trying to block their rise. They see themselves still as an emerging country. So there's a lot of misunderstanding on both sides, given the paradigms that are at play. I think the underlying problem between the two countries is this reality. The United States became the world's largest economy in about 1880. We've been #1 ever since. It's a long stretch. Of course, we peaked right around World War II. But in recent decades, our economy's been strong, but as other countries have reemerged, our relative place in the global economy has changed to the point where now China actually in 2015 surpassed us in GDP by purchasing power parity, which is one of the two ways of measuring GDP. By the more traditional measure, they have not yet surpassed us, but still. This is really seen as a big challenge in Washington. I saw this when I worked in the Congress already, and I see it when I go out there today. There's just a sense that we're losing our place somehow and that we must resist this. So these are traditional geopolitical disagreements, competitions that are really engulfing a lot of the world's attention today. But in the background, we have perhaps deeper threats and long-term existential threats involving climate and sustainability. In just a couple of days, on the 30th of November, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP28, will get underway in Dubai. It'll be from November 30th to December 12th. And these issues are of great concern to many Americans. Many young Americans are very concerned when I talk to my students and such. These issues are very much at the forefront of their agenda. In fact, I think you could argue that there is a generational divide emerging in the United States that may have an impact on the 2024 election. Recent polling, for example, NBC poll last week showed that among 18 to 34-year-olds today, 70% disagree with Biden's foreign policy priorities. For the younger generation, I think sustainability is important, and they see how geopolitical problems and confrontations are causing climate to take a rear seat because of Ukraine and the energy crisis. As Russian oil and gas has been cut off from Europe, many countries are going back to coal. And this is a very broad trend right now in Europe. And so both, I think, among the young, certainly in Europe, and I think in our country, but also in the global South, which will be most impacted by climate change, this is an increasingly important issue. And here, I think this chart is worth bearing in mind. I've shown this before, but I think some things are bear repeating. The demographic realities of this century and really of the lifetime of my students. At current projections, of course, these are the current UN projections. Things can change, obviously, but at present it's looking like it's heading this way, in which Africa will account for 40% of humanity. Asia, of course, already is a huge proportion. And what is the West? United States and Europe will be down to about 8% of humanity. Now, and this is I think, a very important statistic to look to. The Russians and the Chinese have seized upon this in their approach to the developing world. They refer to the global South as the global majority and encourage these countries to think of themselves in those terms. And they pose the question, why should we be listening to the West, which is a demographically dwindling part of the planet? So, as I say, these same attitudes, I think, are seen in the polling here. I was very struck by a Quinnipiac University poll that came out about 2 weeks ago. that showed among 18 to 34-year-olds nationwide, nearly 40% opted for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and about 32% for Biden, 27% for Trump. When I saw that statistic, it was amazing. And RFK Jr. has said in a recent speech just in the past couple of days that if he's elected, he plans to fulfill the promise of John F. Kennedy in his American University speech shortly before he was assassinated, wanting to pursue a peace policy globally. And Kennedy's idea was to end the Cold War, or at least bring it into a more manageable state. And RFK Jr. kind of echoes some of the Republicans in Congress in wanting to draw back from some of the geopolitical commitments we have right now. So it's to my mind, an unusual mix of opinion right now. And the basic dichotomy is between the old-fashioned, if you will, geopolitical issues and these new challenges of sustainability, kind of epitomized in COP28, which is taking place now in just the next couple of days. So on this basis, I'm going to describe the state of play, sort of update a number of issues that are out there, starting with Ukraine. And as I said, China is to some extent interwoven into all these crises. So here we have the map, not of the current war, but the territory that Russia has already annexed. The Russian parliament has declared this part of Ukraine now Russian territory. It's officially, as far as Russian law is concerned, part of Russia. And it's roughly the eastern 20% of Ukraine. There are many people who believe that eventually Russia will push a bit further and certainly try to take Odessa down in the lower left there as this unfolds. I think for the Russians, for Putin, they see this part of Ukraine as a kind of a Russian-speaking area close to the Russian heartland. In fact, their invasion has, if anything, created a common Ukrainian sense of nationality now, even among the Russian speakers. So to some extent, the Russians have produced the opposite result, but they're forging ahead with this plan. I think they do not intend to conquer or attack Western Ukraine. Western Ukrainians are very anti-Russian, and the Russians know this, but they want to stabilize things in keeping this territory. Now, the problem today is that there's been very little change in the front lines since spring. The Russian-Ukrainian counteroffensive has been difficult. Ukraine's been taking very heavy losses. You know, in military terms, whenever you're on the offense, you tend to take higher losses. Ukrainian Television One this week reported that there have been over 1,100,000 Ukrainian killed and missing in action, which is far higher than the usual statistics you hear. The Ukrainian government is criticizing the media for reporting this. They're contesting it, but there's no question that Ukraine is taking heavy losses, as are the Russians, of course. Now, because the front line is blocked, the strategy has shifted a bit to attacking Crimea directly. We're providing the Ukrainians with some very sophisticated weaponry. The British have given them Storm Shadow missiles. They're fired from airplanes, from jets, 155-mile range on these. They're very accurate. So there have been a number of attacks into Crimea that have actually hit the general staff and that sort of thing. So the Russians are pulling their assets further back. And just this week, there's a report that China, this is unconfirmed, but that China will work with Russia to build an undersea tunnel between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine. In other words, connecting Crimea to Ukraine in a way that gets around the vulnerability of the bridge that they've constructed there. This is unconfirmed, but some pretty reliable sources have come up with this. We then, after the British did this, provided the Ukrainians with ATACMS missiles. That's an acronym. Yes, they do attack, but it's an acronym. These are very, very dangerous missiles with a 300-mile range, and the Ukrainians have begun to use those as well. So the line of conflict is stalled, but these kind of things now are entering the fray, and the question is how the Russians will react over time. But the problem is that this war is basically a trench war, like World War I, if anything, in which artillery, manpower, and ammunition are key. Now, we have not fought a war like that since really World War II. Our wars in recent times have been in places like Iraq and elsewhere where, we're using our Air Force, we're attacking from the air, not as much in the way of ground skirmishes. So as a result, our armaments industry is not prepared to support a war like this long term. And so the ammunition shortages are beginning to appear. And it'll be difficult to ramp up production, especially now that we're being asked by the Israelis to supply ammunition and other ordnance in Gaza. So the situation in Ukraine, quite frankly, is disturbing. And the chief of forces, the overall commander of Ukrainian forces, gave an interview in early November to The Economist in which he basically said the war has ground down to a stalemate. And he said the following: we need to look at other solutions. And I think he means things like the F-16, because we need a speedy victory. Sooner or later, we're going to find that we simply don't have enough people to fight. And that's the dilemma. The Russians have ample manpower, and they're able to dragoon, recruit. They haven't had to have a draft. They've been able to find enough soldiers, and they have a huge advantage in artillery and ammunition. Now, Zaluzhny's admission, and here he is with Zelensky, they've been comrades, but now they are bitterly opposed to each other. Zelensky is blaming Zaluzhny for admitting a stalemate because he believes that if that really becomes the perception, the West will begin to lose interest. And the question will arise, why are we supplying arms in a losing cause? Or at least one that is going to be going on for a long, long time. So on top of all of this, and I hate to sound too pessimistic, but I'm very concerned about Ukraine and their ability now to prevail in this. It's a terrible winter in Ukraine. The last week or two, heavy winds, snow, bitter cold. Last winter was an easy one. This winter is beginning, at least, to be quite difficult. And so a lot of towns don't have electricity. The Russians have been attacking infrastructure, electricity with drones. And so it's a question of how they can get through this and emerge to the spring. Now, this is where China comes in. Because in Washington, a major reason for going all the way with Ukraine, regardless of how difficult it is and how not hopeless but stalemated it appears to be now, is that we do not want to send the wrong signal to China regarding Taiwan. In other words, if we falter on Ukraine, allow Russia to prevail to any extent to get something out of this invasion, this is a signal it would send to the Chinese. It might make them more aggressive on Taiwan. There's another argument that says that the Chinese are learning the opposite from this, that the Russians were hasty in doing this, that they are taking huge losses themselves. Their military hasn't performed that well, and so maybe China should be more cautious, actually, because they haven't fought a war since the war against Vietnam in the 70s, and they don't know how their military would perform. But I think in Washington, it's more the feeling that we cannot falter here because it's the wrong signal. It's not exactly, but a little bit like the domino theory during Vietnam, where the idea was if we didn't prevail in Vietnam, the dominoes would start to fall in Southeast Asia and beyond. So that's the situation. I mean, we have to be hopeful, and Washington right now, because funding is blocked in the Senate and because, and the House, and because we're giving more to Israel now, we're turning to our European allies to step up and give more now to Ukraine in the coming months. So we'll see whether they do that. We're really leaning on Germany to send a lot in, because the functioning of the Kiev government depends totally on our funding from the West. I mean, it's totally dependent on Western aid to continue. So we have done a very good job in managing NATO. We've done a great job on alliance management, if you will. Kept the alliance together. Sweden and Finland, of course, are joining NATO, and that's been all to the good. But more broadly, it's been a mixed bag. If you look out to this global south, as it's emerging now as a more and more important factor, they have not gone along with the U.S. position on Ukraine. They are not participating in the sanctions. You can see here the countries that are, and it's basically our allies. Many of them have been doing business with Russia, of course, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, even Israel has done a lot of business with Russia since the invasion. And so our narrative, trying to galvanize global support on Ukraine, has had a hard time getting traction. And I think Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, here he is with Putin recently, is an example of an African leader who says publicly that that the problems Africa's having now with inflation, food inflation, energy inflation, not because of the Russian invasion, but because of Western sanctions. That if the West had not put the sanctions on, the developing world wouldn't be having these problems. Now, we, of course, were stunned that they would have that interpretation, and we've been trying to activate our diplomacy in Africa, Latin America, elsewhere. We're convening big conferences on Ukraine, trying to correct this narrative and get more support, but so far that really hasn't happened. And Ramaphosa is also, like some other developing world leaders, has referred to Ukraine as a European problem. It has really little to do with them as far as he's concerned, and he's even said that the attention that Ukraine gets in CNN and the media contrasts with the attention the West pays to issues in the global South, and is an example of ongoing European white racism, in fact. So their interpretation is quite different. And it's an example right now of Western isolation from opinion out in this global South. And both Russia and China, of course, are maximizing this situation. So the other result of Ukraine, and one that once again will get us now into China again, and we've talked about this previously as well. I mean, part of our sanctions was to take the step of seizing and freezing Russian assets. Roughly about a half of Russian state assets, which were parked in the West, about $325 billion in Western banks and institutions. And so we hold that. A lot of people would like to use it to rebuild Ukraine eventually. But it's one thing to freeze assets, another thing to just seize them. So an offshoot of this policy now was pointed to by Janet Yellen, our Secretary of the Treasury. She's the most fearful. She's much more fearful, a much more fearful weapon in Russian eyes than the ATACMS missiles. I mean, this is the real threat. You know, Janet Yellen and her sanctions. So speaking before Congress last month, Janet Yellen admitted to the Congress. She said, you know, our sanctions have motivated some countries to seek alternatives to the dollar, unfortunately. And Janet Yellen said, we should expect a decline in the dollar as the global reserve currency because of this. And she said that actually just in the past year, holdings of dollars have gone down by 8% globally. Now, she says this is a natural desire to diversify. But at the same time, she said this is temporary, that long term there's no alternative to the dollar, and that we should not fear. Anyway, I find it striking that our Secretary of Treasury admits that this is what's happening. And there are, in fact, and here now we're going to come full bore into China, and this is actually going to lead us directly to Gaza. As I say, these things are really interwoven. China is now the greatest purchaser of Saudi oil and gas. And the relationship between Saudi Arabia and China has gotten quite close during a time when there's been friction with the Biden administration with Saudi Arabia. China also, as a member of the BRICS, it's such a jolly group when they get together. They always have these, dancing, raising their arms, anyway. The BRICS, it's not an alliance. It's not a military alliance, but it is an entente, and it is a cooperative mechanism, which is gaining in importance. Brazil, China, South Africa, India, Russia. So at their last summit this fall, the BRICS rolled out a new gold-backed cryptocurrency, which they plan to start using in 2024 already. Now this, of course, this is a very concrete example of working around the dollar, and it's under Chinese auspices. I don't think that there's not going to be we're not, as tourists, we're not going to go around with BRICS currency, we're not going to be using it as tourists, but this could be used as a clearing mechanism among countries in their bilateral and even multilateral trade. This could happen. And countries like China especially are buying up gold right now. The gold market is being very much impacted by the idea of a gold-backed currency. The dollar was backed by gold up until the early 70s when the Nixon shocks took place. So, concern and this with what China's doing, and just as much at this same meeting, the BRICS expanded. And look where they expanded. They expanded right into the Middle East. Saudi Arabia joined, Iran joined, Egypt joined, Ethiopia. And you can see in yellow the countries that are applying for membership. Now, once again, it's not an alliance, but it's very much a coordinating mechanism. It's something that, in terms of Chinese policy, Belt and Road, and also initiatives in the Middle East, is of importance. So this intrusion now of China into the Middle East is beginning to inform our policies toward the region. All the more because there is a slight military dimension to this. There have been recent naval exercises in the Gulf with Russia, China, and Iran. Also this fall, China has had a fairly dysfunctional diplomacy, especially during COVID, what's called wolf warrior diplomacy, where they really were offending countries and being too harsh in the way they were reacting. They're emerging from COVID much more astute in their diplomacy, far more intelligent in the way they're going about things. And one of the first indications of this was a Chinese-mediated reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This really caught Washington off guard. Under Chinese auspices, Saudi Arabia and Iran have established diplomatic relations. In the context of the Gaza crisis right now, they're meeting bilaterally. So all the more reason for Washington now to want to get more actively involved in the Middle East. All this is before Gaza. So on the eve of Gaza, the one very striking initiative that we took, it was at the G20 meeting last month. We announced a new corridor, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Now, this is clearly meant to challenge or counteract China's corridor building in Eurasia. Here you can see the corridor wars, as they're called now in geopolitics. So in the red, you've got the Chinese aspects of the Chinese Belt and Road, which has been going on since 2013. Over 100 countries are involved in the Belt and Road now. And these are fast-speed rail lines going across Eurasia into Europe. Well, now what we're proposing is a link between India to Dubai, through Saudi Arabia, then through Jordan and Israel, and then across to Europe. These will be train lines. So for this to happen, of course, we have to have a very good relationship with Saudi Arabia, and we have to have stability in the Holy Land. This is premised on that, because as you can see, it goes right out through Jordan, through Israel. It'll come out at Haifa. And what's happening right now in Gaza is, frankly, putting all this on the back burner. So to discuss Gaza now, I want to go back just a bit. Ever since the formation of Israel in the late 40s and with the UN mandates that emerged, a two-state solution has been the fundamental departure point for Western policy and for US policy toward Israel and Palestine. The idea that there should be a negotiated Palestinian state. Most variants of this would have this Palestinian state be comprised of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And this would be a guaranteed result. Now, in 1994, the Oslo Accords during Bill Clinton were a concrete step in that direction. But it didn't go anywhere. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin influenced things. But a one-state solution remained US policy and was pushed by various presidents until 2014. 2014 is the last time that the United States really forwarded the two-state solution. It was when Obama brought together Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, they're both still involved, to try to find some kind of departure point for negotiations on a two-state solution. It didn't go anywhere for a variety of reasons. And at that point, the Obama administration turned to the Iran nuclear deal. They basically said, okay, put the Middle East on the back burner. Let's turn to the Iran nuclear deal. The last 2 years, that's what they were involved with. Well, Trump didn't just neglect Palestine and the Middle East. He actively was aggressive toward Palestine. He cut funding for the Palestinian Relief Organization. He took other steps. So during the whole Trump years, there was no talk of the two-state solution. Trump's first visit as president was to Saudi Arabia. Usually presidents go to Canada or Mexico or Europe. He went to Saudi Arabia. And of course, a year into his administration, Ivanka opened the new US embassy in Jerusalem. Once again, East Jerusalem is supposed to be part of a Palestinian state. Some presidents have said that they would move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but no president had ever done that until Donald Trump. This was a clear sign of a change in US policy. And the basic policy, and one that now is coming back very much, was the Abraham Accords. This was a policy that was basically steered by the son-in-law. Jared Kushner is the one who really negotiated and worked on the Abraham Accords. The basic concept was this, that the US should try to get the Arab states to reconcile with Israel, fully recognize Israel, develop economic relations. The whole region then will blossom, and benefits would trickle down to the Palestinians. In other words, an economic approach, ignoring the identity, historical, all the other issues that actually inflame the conflict. Now, the Democrats criticized this approach. And in his first year or so in office, Biden was on tense terms with the Saudis because of the Khashoggi murder. He really said some very nasty things about Mohammed bin Salman, for example. But once these Chinese forays into the Middle East became apparent and began to multiply, Biden went to Canossa, the famous fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman. And the Biden administration shifted gears and decided to build upon the Abraham Accords, take them the final step to reconcile Saudi Arabia and Israel. And this was the absolute #1 priority for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And they were hoping to bring this about before the end of the year, potentially. Just as the Chinese had reconciled the Saudis and the Iranians, we would reconcile the Saudis and the Israelis. The focus was on this, and literally a day before October 7th, before the Gaza Al-Aqsa flood, as it's called, Jake Sullivan, our fine young man from Southwest High School in Minneapolis, who is the National Security Advisor, wrote an article for the Foreign Affairs, the premier foreign affairs journal, on U.S. foreign policy generally, and in it said that the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. He has been lampooned for this because literally the next day the opposite proved to be the case. But I think for the Biden team, they were focused elsewhere. They just assumed and hoped that the whole region would be stable, that the Palestinians were basically going along with what was happening. So we all know, I won't go into detail about the horrendous attack, indefensible by Gaza. And as it's turning out, apparently other groups, once the wall was breached, gangs, probably maybe ISIS types came through as well, to the point now where apparently a number of the hostages, maybe up to 40 of them, are being held by non-Hamas groups, gangs, more radical groups than Hamas, which is a problem in trying to release all the hostages. There are more actors involved than we realized at first. Biden said at a press conference yesterday, he said, "I believe one of the reasons Hamas struck when they did was that they knew that I was working very closely with the Saudis and others in the region to bring peace to the region by having recognition of Israel and of Israel's right to exist." In other words, he's basically saying, yes, that the policies that were being pursued, which were focused anywhere but on the Palestinians, led up to this. And in this case, Biden's kind of bragging about that. But, I mean, it is an indication that Palestinians had been somewhat abandoned. Now, our approach has been controversial. It's being criticized by some groups in our own country, strongly supported by others in our country, to very closely embrace Israel in this time of crisis and need after the Gaza incursion. So right away, Tony Blinken and his team went over to Israel and met with Netanyahu in what looked like a planning meeting. It was a working meeting, I guess, discussing what was coming. The U.S. has sent 2 aircraft carriers, including, this is the largest aircraft carrier on the planet. This is the SS Gerald R. Ford, which is positioned out there. And then Biden himself went to the Middle East to back up Netanyahu. Now, as once this was happening, as Tony Blinken said, we're going to embrace Israel, and then we're going to give Israel advice that only a friend can give. In other words, let's establish credibility and let's advise them. Biden said, don't make the same mistake we made after 9/11. Don't react emotionally. I think the administration hoped that they could, well, keep the Israelis from going too hard on the situation. And in a sense, because the Israelis have not done that, the U.S. has been left dangling, and left dangling in world opinion. Most countries are calling for an immediate ceasefire. There was a vote early on in the Security Council, 14-1, for an immediate ceasefire. We vetoed it. And as an African diplomat said at that time, he said, the U.S. has lost credibility with this veto. What is good enough for Ukraine is not good enough for the Palestinians. The veto told us that Ukrainian lives are more valuable than Palestinian ones. This is an echo of the African reaction I described to Ukraine. It's the same kind of a reaction. Now, the Biden team, I think, wants to make something out of this crisis by going back to the two-state solution. As Biden said late October, there's no going back to the status quo as it stood on October 6th. This means that when the crisis is over, there has to be a vision of what comes next. And in our view, it has to be a two-state solution. So the U.S. now is pivoting back to a two-state solution. The question is, how realistic is it, given all that's happened, and how this would take place? I mean, a kind of an ironic aspect of this. Here's the article, the issue that where Jake Sullivan had this article in which there was no mention of a two-state solution at all. I mean, the focus was not at all on Palestine. And so the State Department has contacted Foreign Affairs and asked them to insert a new paragraph in the online edition in which our support for a two-state solution is spelled out. So we're trying to adjust our policy accordingly. We'll see where this goes now. Northern Gaza has been cleared, and now it's a question of what happens in southern Gaza, where a lot of the Palestinians have fled. There's some light in the recent days with the freeing of hostages. There's been a succession of exchanges. Israeli Hamas held hostages for Palestinian detainees in Israel. I believe it's been extended for another 2 days, and so the question is, can we keep extending it? Biden is saying, let's extend the truce, keep extending the truce, but the U.S. still has not come out for a ceasefire. And the Israelis are making it clear that they plan to resume the conflict once the hostages are exchanged. You know, it's a difficult situation in the greater Middle East, or rather greater Israel, which includes West Bank, Gaza, and Israel itself. There are about 7.3 million Jewish Israeli citizens and about 7.3 million Arabs. These are, you know, how do you get these groups to finally accommodate? And that's going to be the whole drama going forward. Just yesterday, reports are coming out that in Istanbul, there are groups of representatives of various countries and organizations coming together to launch an international campaign to save Gaza. And the idea is to form a flotilla of 1,000 vessels, which will sail off of Gaza, hospital ships, supplies, all kinds of things, basically to break the siege. Now, this happened in 2010 when there was another siege on Gaza. The Turkish government helped to support a flotilla of 6 ships that did the same thing, and they were attacked by the Israelis. The IDF attacked the ships, and people died. It was a huge crisis in Turkish relations with Israel. So if this comes to be, what will happen if not 1,000, at least hundreds of ships suddenly park off of Gaza? What will happen? So this is another potentially complicating issue. I might point out that on October 7th, we had no ambassador in Israel, no ambassador in Egypt, no ambassador in Oman, no ambassador in Kuwait. That's a whole nother story of our representation abroad and the need for more money for diplomacy. We have to be on the playing field for situations like this. And we'll see what happens now with the corridor. As you can see, with the Middle East the way it is, there's no way that the last part of that corridor can really take place. Now, more on China specifically, because the China factor now is starting to enter into the way we organize our economy here at home. One of the challenges from China is in high tech, semiconductors, especially AI. I've mentioned this before, but I'll repeat it, that a Blue Ribbon Commission in the Congress headed by Eric Schmidt of Google reported last year to Congress that China now, in their view, was ahead of the U.S. in a number of key technologies, AI, quantum, 5G, 6G, for example. And in that report, Eric Schmidt said basically, we can't leave this up to the private sector. Our corporations, what else should they do but to focus on shareholder value and profits? We can't expect them to understand the implications of their technologies. Therefore, we need a national industrial policy in which the government intervenes. And lo and behold, that policy was announced on April 27th. This is a very important speech. I recommend going online and reading Jake Sullivan's April 27th speech at Brookings, because he laid out the whole philosophy of the Biden administration of what they believe the U.S. should be pursuing. In a nutshell, he talks about the challenges we face, and they are national security challenges. So national security, especially looking toward China, is the justification for a new agenda. And as he pointed out, the main issue is that the American industrial base has been hollowed out. We have overprivileged the financial sector, he said in this speech. We have allowed ourselves to become financialized, and at the expense of more important sectors like semiconductors and infrastructure. We're in a geopolitical confrontation with China, and this has to take precedence. He also mentions an accelerating climate crisis, which ought to lead to more government action too. And then he also mentions inequality and its damage to democracy. All of these are things we cannot expect the private sector to address. And so he's calling for building U.S. domestic capacity, moving beyond trade deals. This is actually building upon Trump. The Biden team has kept all the tariffs that Trump instituted and has added to them. So it's a continuation of the Trump turn on China. We have to protect our foundational technologies. We talk about a small yard and a high fence. We're going to screen U.S. investment in China. We're going to limit U.S. investment in China. We're going to punish companies, American companies, that do business with Chinese companies that have any contact with the Chinese military. And of course, it's very hard to know which company has contacts with the Chinese military, because most of them do. And so this means a much stronger role for the U.S. government. Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, in announcing some of these programs, said that no U.S. corporation that gets any aid from the U.S., subsidies or whatever, may be allowed to issue dividends or buy back stock. So this is, directly intervening. Now, this is provoking a very strong reaction in some quarters. Robert Zoellick, the former head of the World Bank and a high economic official in the George H.W. Bush administration, has been writing articles accusing Sullivan and his ilk of being revolutionaries who seek an ideological transformation of the United States society and capitalism. He accuses them of being engaged in huge unfunded spending, up to 10% of GDP. He accuses them of ignoring price signals. And he says the result is going to be inflation and still higher interest rates, and that this is a great threat. I mean, it's true that the CHIPS and Science Act, up to $1 trillion worth of subsidies will be issued in this as we try to attract supply chains home. Even more apoplectic than Bob Zoellick is The Economist magazine. They have been on a tirade in recent issues. Our free markets history, they talk about the rise of homeland economics. What Jake Sullivan is proposing to them is homeland economics. The Economist says it's like the 1930s, not like the rise of Hitler, but the breakdown of the global economy in the 30s that led to World War II. And to quote The Economist, the U.S. is engaging in a protectionist, high subsidy, intervention-heavy, ideologically infused policy administered by an ambitious state. I mean, that's I think The Economist was founded in the 1830s on liberal terms, and you can just hear the echoes of Bagot in that. And so they have no time for this. The Financial Times has referred to the U.S. messianic belief in the power of government, sudden faith in tariffs, subsidies, bureaucratic checks on investment, and they sum it up by saying we're heading for a damaging retreat into a segmented and cartelized global economy. So as you can see, some people are not happy with what's happening. If I can sum it up, although they do so more colorfully than I could do. So we'll see. I mean, I'm surprised that this hasn't protruded more into CNN and the papers and things, because these are sharp disagreements. And it is true that our deficit is rising quite fast. It's passing 33 trillion now. I mean, to their credit, the Biden administration, after unleashing all these subsidies and things, they went to the Congress and tried to get a progressive tax increase. And of course, that was not likely to happen. So it's kind of like trying to cross a river in two jumps. You know, we've taken the first step, but now how do we pay for this? So stay tuned. But this is another aspect of how China, ultimately, it's China really that is, I mean, are we becoming more like China in competing with China? That's what some people are asking. China, meanwhile, is beginning to go its own way. It's kind of drawn conclusions from our tech restrictions, semiconductor restrictions, and so they are kind of drawing back from buying our bonds. They're involved in some of the initiatives I talked about. Last fall, for the first time, China did more trade with the developing world than it did with the US, Europe, and Japan combined. That is a major change, because China's rise has come really through trade with the West. And in the last year or so, trade just with Southeast Asia has surpassed Chinese trade with the US. So, you know, this trade agreement, which was signed 2 years ago, is a very deep one. It's creating new supply chains. China's at the center of it, and frankly, it includes some of our allies in this. One further point on what's happening: the IMF, International Monetary Fund, issued a report in October saying that current policies are having an unintended effect. So whereas theoretically we're trying to de-risk or even decouple from China, The IMF says, no, that's not what's happening. What's happening is a reshuffling. And what they mean is that China now is dealing with and trading with and actually setting up companies in places like Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. And then we are turning to those countries in order not to buy from China. But in fact, we're still buying indirectly from China. It just costs more because there's a middleman. So the IMF says that this is causing an increasing level of complexity and is inflationary. And they do cite China's relations with Vietnam as an example of what's actually going on. So we'll see where all this leads. It's a very complicated position, but as I say, our dealing with the China challenge is at the center of all of this. Now, to conclude, you've got all these geopolitical, geoeconomic tensions, and in 3 days, COP28 will open. 197 parties are involved. COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt ended on a downbeat note. It was a very poor final communique. People kind of disagreed at the end. China and the US were not cooperating because of the geopolitical tensions. There was much less cooperation between the US and China. And so everyone is hoping that COP28 will rectify some of this. 2023 is on course to be the hottest year on record globally. We have already breached the 1.5 centigrade threshold on several occasions. We're at about 1.2, 1.3, but rising and protruding up from there at a certain times. Here you can see the annual emissions by world region heading into COP28. Obviously, China is a huge polluter. We are as well, and together with the European Union, we're the West, if you will, is a big part of this. Look how little Africa pollutes, for example. And Africa, frankly, is the region of the world that will suffer most from climate change. All experts agree on that. The UN has come out with a summation of the global tipping points of climate. In yellow, things that could tip at even at 1 degree centigrade, where we already are, or up toward 3 increase. Tipping point means that it cannot be reversed. Once it gets to that point, it becomes self-sustaining and cannot be reversed. So you can see at the various levels, I mean, 5 is, if we get to 5, we're really in trouble. So this is kind of the warning map. And the UN has also come up with 6 interconnected risk tipping points. This is different from climate, and they're kind of an interesting array. And these are things that are happening now. So the first UN interconnected risk is accelerating extinctions. I think we talked about that at dinner a little earlier, that there are, extinctions, fewer songbirds, all kinds of things. But the problem is that extinctions can trigger chain reactions in any ecosystem and can disrupt the whole ecosystem, right? If an element of a mosaic is removed, it can impact the others, because there's a food chain usually, and there's an ecosystem. So that's the first one. Second is groundwater depletion, which is happening in many countries, draining the water and putting the food supply at risk. This is the kind of thing that will push immigration out of certain parts of the world, and the UN right now is debating whether to adopt a new category of refugee, climate change refugees. The third one is mountain glaciers melting. That's already happening. The fourth one is a little bit off topic, but it's of concern. Space debris. Elon Musk has sent up tens of thousands of satellites, and there are other private entities in the UK and elsewhere that are doing the same. It's getting very crowded up there. I don't know if you've seen that. If you look at the night sky, sometimes you'll see a train of like 10 or 15 lights in single file. And this is a launch of SpaceX, and it's orbiting that way. So the danger is that this can cause the loss of multiple satellites and lead to tensions. China is already raising this and threatening to respond if they see their satellites get caught up in the space traffic from the private sector. Fifth one is unbearable heat, making it hard to live in some places. Yes, it's happening already. And then six, an uninsurable future. In other words, when the risk of climate change rises to a certain point, it can make homes unaffordable because it'll cost too much to get an insurance company to insure I mean, there are certain parts of the U.S. already that are seeing the beginning of this kind of a problem. So anyway, all these things are to be discussed. And as I mentioned before, coming out of Ukraine, many countries are going back to coal. So the mood on the eve of this climate conference, frankly, is concerned, to say the very least. And actually, people are kind of blaming the geopolitical situation for this. Here's kind of what we're supposed to be doing coming out of Paris in 2015. And one of the main focuses, and for this conference as well, is financing, that rich countries must provide up to $100 billion from 2020 on as a floor for the developing world, for the Africas that are suffering but didn't cause the problem. And it's called the Loss and Damage Fund. And there's talk of bringing it up maybe to even $300 billion. But there are no specifics, no legal mandate for liability, who funds, who qualifies, no concrete commitment, nothing has been done. And as a result, no money has been transferred. And coming into this conference, it's looking like developing countries are not in a mood to make these commitments at this point. This will be the main thing to watch at the climate conference. There are some people, pessimists, who predict that if it becomes clear that there's no movement, that the countries from the developing world may boycott and pull out of the conference, which would be not a good thing. So let's hope that that's not going to be the case. You know, already at the Davos conference in Switzerland this January, the final report said basically that geopolitical misunderstandings now are threatening the planet because they are making climate cooperation more and more unsustainable. Young people also, I was the moderator in September for a fireside chat between the visiting Norwegian Prime Minister, who was on his way to the UN General Assembly, and Senator Amy Klobuchar. And it was at Norway House. About 400 people were there. And not far into the conference or chat, as Amy was speaking and talking about Ukraine, a climate protest emerged out of the audience. Young people with banners. And their basic idea, why are you paying so much attention to Ukraine? Why aren't you focused on climate? And as I mentioned, I think there's a generational divide on these issues. I think a lot of younger people see climate as very much a priority and wonder what we're doing with some of our other priorities. As I say, the polls indicate that this could be an issue. I think both climate and Gaza are wild cards for youth attitudes. And it was, to my mind, very unfortunate when yesterday it was announced that President Biden will not attend the COP28 meeting, nor does Kamala Harris have any plan to attend COP28. And Biden spokespeople said that the president is very burdened with the war between Israel and Hamas. This is consuming his time. And John Kerry, who's our climate envoy, said, yes, they've got the war in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine. There's a bunch of things going on. Well, I mean, this is seen out in the developing world, and I think probably by a lot of young people, as indicative of the basic problem. And it's going to be a matter of, I guess, a future debate over what the priorities are. And I mean, maybe we can do everything at the same time, but the issues are there. So to end on a light note, Biden and Xi did meet finally in San Francisco last month. I don't think it really changed the underlying tensions, but they agreed on what they called a few gestures. So it's kind of small steps, one on climate, a fairly vague commitment, but at least they were talking together on this. So we'll see whether that has any impact on COP28. And also, the Chinese took a step in our direction by agreeing to help on ethanol, which has been a huge priority for the U.S. All the components from ethanol come from China. And ever since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, geopolitics, the Chinese have ceased cooperation on fentanyl. And our numbers of deaths are going up and up and up. So once again, a small step. So welcome to the Anthropocene. Here we are. And as I say, I think in the coming election, some of these international and climate issues may actually play a role more than we're used to. And as I say, the polls are starting to show that potentially. So, you know, when, as I say, when 40% of young people say they're going to vote for RFK Jr., you know something's going on. And by the way, yeah, in a recent speech, he said that his goal will be to fulfill JFK's destiny and his intentions for a more peaceful world. I don't know what that means, but, you know, it's potentially compelling to a lot of young voters. So we'll see. So thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Any questions?
Stunned silence. Here we have one over here.
While I'm walking over there, Tom, maybe you could comment on North Korea?
Well, so North Korea, yeah.
Too late.
So no, I'll comment. So Kim Jong-un is providing ammunition and drones to the Russians. They had a summit in first time that Kim Jong-un has left North Korea. And so in eastern Russia, he met with Putin, and they signed all kinds of deals. There's rumors that the Russians are perhaps going to help North Korea with missile technology. The problem is, and this is once again a disconnect geopolitically, because of China and U.S. tensions, the Chinese have stopped helping us on North Korea. They're kind of giving North Korea a bit of a green light. So the North Koreans have been rapidly increasing their nuclear potential and their missile potential, which is causing their neighbors in Asia to be upset. There's a sense that on some level, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans are cooperating in a number of areas. And so the question is, would they be doing that ordinarily? I mean, Zbigniew Brzezinski, former national security advisor, once famously wrote in one of his books that the one thing that could challenge the U.S. internationally is if we succeeded, as he put it, in pushing China, Iran, and Russia together in an alliance of common grievances against us. I mean, nobody knows. They're not natural allies ordinarily. China is very worried about North Korea's nuclear program, as are we. Russia and Iran have not been close allies. So at least for the time being, those countries are cooperating more, and North Korea is doing things that are, I mean, I think one reason that South Korea now has a more right-wing government, as it does, is because of the fear of what North Korea is up to. So, yeah, that's something, maybe if Trump comes back, he had that bromance with Kim Jong-un. They were writing love letters to each other, literally. And so who knows? Yeah.
So just a couple of quick observations, one of which is I remember, I think, listening to you before. I've heard you a number of times, and I remember one of your conversations was about sanctions and how sanctions can work well in some situations, but oftentimes they don't. It sounds like, based on what I've heard you talk about today, a lot of these sanctions have had a deleterious effect on things. The other thing is I spent some time in my career working in the semiconductor industry in Silicon Valley. And one of the promising things, I think, as you were talking about, you know, I think you talked about quantum computers, computing, and also in a previous discussion with us, and semiconductor chips and how much they're in the news. And of course, one company that we all hear about regularly is a company called NVIDIA.
Yes.
Now, when we talk about the AI space, we're primarily talking about a company like NVIDIA. And right now, NVIDIA supplies about 85% of the world's chips that are used for AI, cloud computing, and other things. So we have something at least good going on there. But China overall I guess, produces more chips than we do. But I think the key differentiator right now are these AI chips that are very, very expensive, that the demand is much greater than the supply right now. And what happened recently is that the U.S. government said, look, you know, some of these chips are finding their way into China, and so, you know, we don't want that to happen anymore. So they started investigating further. Now, how NVIDIA has responded to that, they're now producing lower performing chips that don't act as quickly, I guess, make as many decisions. So they're trying to find ways to get around that by selling lower performance chips. But I think that's this whole AI and chip industry thing, and looking back to Jake's paper back in a few years ago, I mean, how telling is that this wasn't a big issue back then, and he kind of brought it up, and now it's, you know, if you read the Wall Street Journal or stay up on the business world, I mean, this is a daily discussion on what's going on.
Absolutely. So. No, excellent comments. Yes, and of course, NVIDIA's stock has just been, you know, in the stratosphere. There's another company, TSMC, in Taiwan, that also produces a big chunk of high-end chips. Maybe not quite as high-end as NVIDIA. I don't know.
They actually make NVIDIA's chips.
Okay, so they make NVIDIA's chips.
They manufacture NVIDIA's chips.
That's it. So the because I always hear that about 90% of the high-end chips are manufactured at TSMC
right.
and for NVIDIA then. Okay, that explains that. So yeah, and we don't want China having easy access to those very advanced chips. And that's why we have new, very draconian rules against any company that violates our rules and laws now about not engaging with, I mean, there's jail time involved, actually. And I mean, I speak to a certain number of lawyer groups, and you know, who are asked to advise companies about what they can and can't do, and they're saying, how can we really know in some cases what their contacts are and what exactly is happening? And there are a number of due diligence companies in China, Western due diligence companies, who for years performed this kind of research to see what, and China's closing them all down. They're trying to blind us on this. Now, China is, yes, NVIDIA is trying to work around it with lower quality chips and still have a market in China. The Chinese themselves have been working creatively with lower quality chips and are having some success. There's a new Huawei phone, which apparently is very competitive, and they've managed to do without access to our chips. So I don't know what kind of a capacity whether they're at a level now where they could move somehow toward doing this themselves. I think a lot of people are skeptical that they could do that without a direct Western boost at this point.
I used to work for Huawei in China.
Did you? Well, what do you think about that?
Well, of course, they were sanctioned for a number of years.
Yes, they were.
And then you had the chairman
detained by the Canadians. Yeah.
We tried to extradite her unsuccessfully. And then actually a friend of mine from Korea ended up spending time in a Chinese prison a year and a half along with the Canadian ambassador in China, Michael Spavor.
Right.
My friend who spent time in. So there's been a lot going on, but I think the latest thing is it sounds like some of the restrictions perhaps are being eased a little bit.
Yep.
Huawei, because Huawei has been the one firm that the U.S. has targeted.
Yes.
Certainly for sanctions more than anybody else. And if you look at their performance, I mean, they dove off the cliff. I mean,
Yep.
They literally had hardly any revenues in the last couple of years. Now they're starting to come up.
Yep.
And like any Chinese firm, they have good technology, but they know how to do it cheaper.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem.
Competing on price, and
Yep.
that's why they're successful.
Yep. And I think our main concern is, these very high-end chips have military use, and it's for AI in national security, and that's where we really don't want the Chinese to have access, right? No, it's going to be very complex to see how this goes forward. We have convinced TSMC to stop cooperating with China. A lot of people were surprised that the Dutch, or rather that the Taiwanese went along. And the Dutch apparently create the boards, right? They create there's one company in Holland that's very important in the chip production too. And we've gotten them to draw back from China too. So we're having some success with our allies in trying to keep. But the Chinese, they currently produce more engineers than the rest of the OECD combined. I mean, they're investing massively in tech education and tech, and so at some point that's going to be part of the equation. And I know that TSMC, in coming over here, has complained that they can't find qualified workers, and they're telling us that the production will be much more expensive than what they were able to do in Taiwan and send over here. So once again, it's another inflationary element coming out of our national security concerns. Yeah.
It's my understanding that there's a decent portion of the world that feels that we're too supportive of Israel in this Hamas issue. And the question I have is, long term, is there another potential for a 9/11 style blow up where Hamas or some faction from that region comes and attacks us actually?
Well, I mean, the CIA and the FBI, right after October 7th, within a week afterwards, warned that there was a rising risk of terrorism. They actually sent out alerts for Americans traveling. That, I guess you expect them to do that. I think there's no evidence at present. But it is true, in a lot of the developing world, well, I'm just parroting conversations I've had with diplomats and individuals from outside of the European region. They see, rightly or wrongly, they see Israel as the last example of European settler colonialism, kind of like the end of a long era. They very much see it in white versus non-white terms. Israel has got very good relations, and they have a dynamite economy in the high-tech sector, so they are active in many countries. They have a lot of solid relations with many countries, including in the Arab world. And so the question is more, what is the mood on the street? And that's where I think some of the images coming out of Gaza are unfortunate and polarizing, and are, as I say, there's outside of the West, there's almost uniform calls for a ceasefire, at least now. So I don't know, on that terrorist aspect, I can't say, but I know that there were warnings right after October 7th that this could be in the cards potentially. I don't know. Yes.
You mentioned your dealings with students and the 40% who want RFK or who are interested in RFK. I also teach students, and I'm still fascinated by the number of kids who talk about, TikTok, for instance.
Oh yeah.
And you say, do you realize where this is going? And it doesn't matter to them. It doesn't matter at all. And I'm just curious. You asked the question of what are our priorities as a country, and are we ever going to have them? Because I think we are so divided now, And I think with social media and everything else, I don't know if that divide, how you bridge that,
Yeah.
because it's not just kids. It's any age level, but
Yeah.
I don't know. How do you see us forming a priority when we are carved, and those Russia and China, they're not going to beat us militarily necessarily, but they know how to get the information to divide us, and that's way cheaper.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it's of great concern. No, I've had the experience, same thing with TikTok. I mean, it's so popular. I mean, Nikki Haley wants to ban TikTok, right? That's one of her campaign platforms, and there are people in the Congress. And I'm just imagining a huge 1960s type demonstration in Washington by 13-year-old girls. I mean, which is kind of what it would be. No, I mean, and the other thing is this, that younger people today, they're not watching the evening news. The old folks watch the evening news. That's why all the advertisements are for various pharmaceuticals, and advertisements where these young Madison Avenue ambitious types are going back almost like into ancient Egypt and looking for ancient boomer music that they can use as background music for advertisements geared at the boomers, right? Whereas the kids are getting their information from TikTok, Facebook. And when it comes to Gaza, they're getting unfiltered images. On TV, on CNN, it's quite filtered, right? What we see. On TikTok, you can see just graphic stuff of what's going on in Gaza. And so, yeah, that generation is getting its information in a different way, and it has almost a different perception than the old generation that uses the old traditional media. I mean, we've got multiple divides. I think that on climate, it's emerging as perhaps a generational divide as to how high that priority should be. But we've got the right-left divide in Washington too. We have kind of multiple schisms. I suppose any democracy, that's what democracy is. You're supposed to have differences, and the question will be to keep it peaceful and moving forward. So I don't know. And our youth population is becoming increasingly diverse. In the United States, will look a little bit more like the developing world in a couple of decades. And whether that will imply a different outlook, I don't know. So yeah, it's a complicated time for the country, very
We
complicated.
have time for one more question.
Or two, whatever.
Well, I'm just staying on that same topic because what I think you're saying is the division there, nobody's listening to each other. It used to be that the Republicans and Democrats talk to each other, and I talk to my conservative friends and my liberal friends, and now I kind of just look for people that think what I think. And I know I tried to join a group called Braver, I think it's Braver Angels. I don't know if anybody here did that, which came into town, and they wanted to teach us how to, encourage us to talk to each other. And it turned out there were only people from one perspective there, and I don't know that it went anywhere from there, but we're just, we've lost that ability or even the inclination to really talk it through without being angry with each other. So if you got an answer to that, Tom, you could make a lot of money.
Yes, I know. Hopefully this too shall pass, right? Time heals all things. We just have to hope. I didn't answer your question on sanctions. You led off by asking about sanctions, and I just say I think I once referred to a book by Nicholas Mulder, The Economic Weapon, which is about the history of sanctions. And his conclusion is that sanctions very seldom work, and they often have the opposite intent. But the case he cites where sanctions did work was in 1956 when the British and others went into Suez without informing us. And we slapped sanctions on the UK that just brought their economy to its knees. And the Brits relented. And in fact, that's the moment when they realized that they were no longer the center of global finance, and that the City of London was no longer the center. And there's a very informative documentary that you can see on YouTube, British documentary, that documents how that's the point at which the British government, banking, decided to move toward a different kind of finance, deregulate the City of London, eliminate taxes, attract that way, and then set up a series of tax havens that would be basically steered out of London. And that allowed them then to attract a lot of global finance from then on. But they totally shifted gears as a result of being so heavily sanctioned. The other thing with sanctions often drive the population, which often, the sanctioned country, often it's the population, it's common people who suffer the results. The elites are pretty, and so it kind of, it drives them together, right? I mean, an autocratic government can blame the problems economic on sanctions, right? So it can have that opposite effect too. I know when Obama was first elected, remember he gave the speech in Cairo where he opened his fist and said, we're going to approach the Arab world this way and Iran. I think the thinking was that the less we actively opposed Iran or put sanctions on it, the more likely it would be to change. Right? That's when the population might actually begin to stir once that was removed. So sanctions can have a kind of unpredictable impact. Bob.
It seems to me that there's no way that diplomacy is going to solve the problem of environmental change. There's no negotiations that can go on about what's happening with the climate. You can't negotiate with nature. So, and the global issues they're global issues, and they are going to take cooperation, and we're so stuck in competition that this onrushing environmental issue is going to engulf us while we're arguing about whose economic system is better or whose political system is better. And we need cooperation somehow instead of competition. We need the adults in the room to stand up and say, stop bickering and get to the real issue. So it's not a question so much as a comment.
Yeah, well, yes, I mean, something like climate change, all aspects of sustainability, water, all these things, these are global issues. They're not national. There's no one nation that can solve them. It's impossible. So by definition, they're going to require cooperation. President Obama, before he got elected, in the book, The Audacity of Hope, he has a whole section where he says that even though we have different systems, say from China or Russia or other countries, and we disagree with their systems, we can still cooperate with them on issues that concern all of us, right? He was already at that point kind of trying to put that on the back burner a little bit. It's tough to do, and I mean, Taiwan, Ukraine, these are important issues. I mean, there's got to be some kind of resolution of them, but one would hope that a really active diplomacy could somehow, if not solve these things, at least tamp them down for a longer-term resolution, which was the policy we were pursuing initially toward Taiwan. That's been the one China policy, and it's no longer in place as much, right? And the tensions are high. So I don't know. I mean, you don't want to abandon geopolitical concerns, but on the other hand, these other threats will engulf everything eventually, and that's what the younger generation sees more clearly, because we're all kind of in our twilight, kind of looking back and kind of being thankful we had good lives in a better time, and the young people today are looking straight into this. So,
thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks everybody for your attention and for the great conversation. Thank you.